All right, before we go any farther, let's get some definitions down. So we're going to call a stereotype a belief that certain attributes are characteristic of members of a particular group. Prejudice, negative attitude or affective response towards a certain group and its individual members. The word affect here is often used interchangeably with emotion. So an affective response would be like an emotional response. And discrimination, unfair treatment of members of a particular group based on their membership in that group. So let's look at how these concepts map onto our model here of information processing. So we said before that stereotypes can be learned over time. So through whatever it is we're watching, we're hearing things in culture, we're watching the news and whatnot, we're recording these associations. But then we might forget the individual learning episodes, but what we have left are associations stored in our brain. And they can be implicit to the extent that we have forgotten the explicit learning episode, right? Now, we can articulate a stereotype, so we can access a stereotype, and when we're saying it to somebody, that our controlled systems here are articulating the stereotype. The associations here are stored in what we're going to call implicit memory. Now, prejudice then might happen when that association stored in implicit memory has a negative emotional component to it. So negative attitude, for example, towards a group. And then the discrimination can result when that prejudice, that negative association, is influential in the decision-making system, right? And that can happen outside of conscious awareness, right? So people can show discriminatory behavior even though they might explicitly say they do not have a bias or they reject a certain stereotype. But because these associations and implicit memory can have an influence on our behavior, the discriminatory behavior can sneak out, as it were, past our conscious, explicit awareness. Okay, so this distinction then between controlled and automatic raises some questions in research. Subjects may not honestly report their attitudes about race or gender or whatnot, right? So the controlled systems in their brain can mask underlying attitudes. Or they might just be unaware that they harbor any of these biases or preferences. And so psychologists wanted to get at these implicit representations, and the implicit association test is one way to measure these biases, so we don't have to only rely on a subject's explicit reports of their own opinions and views and attitudes. Of course, that raises a sort of a philosophical question. What is the true self? Is it our controlled response or the automatic responses that we might make? And many of us might want to say, well, the self really should be more aligned with what it is we consciously endorse, whatever values they are. And if we have some automatic biases or so on, well, that's unfortunate, but it's not sort of who we really are. Others might want to say, no, these automatic responses do reflect an important part of the self. They can escape beneath our awareness. They can influence our behavior. And while we might disagree or reject these associations, they still nevertheless impact our behavior, and so it must be regarded as part of the self. And you could go further, though, with the automatic responses. I mean, to what degree are these then reflecting the self if they were learned over long periods of time from the culture, right? So to what extent are these automatic responses, these automatic preferences and biases, to what extent are they endorsed or owned or authored by the individual self, or are they more adequately described as sort of being installed by culture or your particular learning history? And so these are tough questions to ponder. So now, to wrap up this section here, we can discuss directly the politics of racism. In the old days, racism expressed itself as explicit endorsements of racial preferences and stereotypes. And so this was characteristic of a generation or so ago, and when many white people, for example, would justify the unequal treatment of minorities with explicit claims of superiority and inferiority. Researchers today argue that there is a new kind of racism. You could think of it as an underground racism, where there is prejudice and discriminatory behavior, but it's alongside the rejection of explicitly racist beliefs. So it's no longer socially acceptable to articulate explicitly racist beliefs. You'll get a lot of negative social feedback from that. But that doesn't mean that the people still don't have some of these biases or prejudices, either consciously felt or beneath a level of awareness. And one of these new types of research paradigms is called symbolic racism. And here the idea is racial prejudice arises from a combination of traditional moral values, for example, the Protestant work ethic and cultural norms of self-reliance and so on, and here again negative affect, emotion, directed at racial and ethnic outgroups. And so this symbolic racism raises the possibility that when people take political positions, so for example, suppose they oppose welfare or affirmative action, it raises the possibility that while they might give you a reason why they oppose welfare, and it's not a racist reason, that reason itself might be related to an underlying prejudice that is either consciously felt or beneath their awareness. So this controlled automatic distinction raises questions about how to interpret someone's policy preferences in the area of political psychology. Now, there is a counterclaim or a counter position to the symbolic racism view, and we're going to call that the principled politics hypothesis. Okay, so here, white Americans with unfavorable attitudes towards racial policies, for example, welfare or busing or affirmative action, are driven by political convictions about the role of government or norms about fairness, and not racial prejudice, right? So the idea is just because a white person is against affirmative action or welfare doesn't mean that he or she is showing racial prejudice. It could be that they genuinely feel that a political principle is being violated and has nothing to do with race, right? So the principled politics hypothesis is sort of taking the position that the reasons that people give for their policy preferences, we should take them at face value. If somebody says they're against affirmative action because it's unfair, it's a kind of reverse discrimination, then we should take that as a reason and take it and not question any underlying motivation, that is the reason that they are objecting to this policy. Of course, the symbolic racism researchers are going to offer a counter argument that these political convictions might just be a cover story for the underlying negative implicit attitudes towards the outgroup, and whether they're conscious or unconscious. So, here are some examples. The desire to reduce the federal debt might be a genuine concern for fiscal responsibility, or a strategy to reduce government payments to outgroup members, right? So the first part here, this would be the principled politics hypothesis, that the principle here is that there's a genuine concern for fiscal responsibility, right? You shouldn't be spending more than you take in revenues. The symbolic racism counter-argument would be, well, that principle might just be a cover for the underlying motivation which is to deny payments to disfavored outgroup members. Another example, asserting that government assistance traps people in a cycle of dependency might be a genuine concern about harming people, or an excuse to not help them. So again, the first one here would be the principled politics view, that there is some principle here, that assistance programs really trap people in a cycle of dependency, right? That's a principle. Knowing, what we know about human psychology, we might say, well, this kind of program actually harms, right? Harms you. It's not good for you. Or it could be that the people are endorsing this view because there is an underlying prejudice against the people who are getting the help, and they just don't want to help those people. Right? Another example, opposition to welfare might capture a desire to avoid supporting free riders, or it might capture anti-black sentiment, for example. So again, the first one here, a desire to avoid supporting free riders, right? The principle here is, well, we don't want government payments to go to people who don't really need it, right? So some people might be taking advantage of the situation, and that's not right. So that's the principle. That's the principled political view. The underlying symbolic racism view would say, well, that principle is masking an anti-black sentiment to the extent that welfare is associated with minorities, and one would have a prejudice against those outgroup members. Final example, asserting that Obama is a socialist might express a genuine reason to vote against him, or mask the fact that he is black. So again, the first one would be the principled politics hypothesis, that someone might genuinely express a negative attitude towards socialism, right? And that would be the justification for opposing Obama. Or the symbolic racist view would be that that principle is masking an anti-black sentiment, that the real reason for opposition to Obama is because he's black, and that the principle of anti-socialism is just a cover story. So you see, then, the fact that we have automatic and controlled processes in the human mind raises this question of motives. What is really driving people's policy preferences and what it is they're saying? Should we take them at their word, or should we consider some of these other processes, implicit biases and prejudices and unconscious processes that might be influencing their views? And it makes interpreting human behavior very complicated.